All right. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through this weekend. I was on Up with Chris, and as many of you know, on occasion I have filled in for Chris Hayes. I've had him on this program many times. This version of the Majority Report, he claims that the first time he ever did media was on the old Majority Report. Maybe the case, I don't know. The point being is that I know that when I am brought on that program, often they are there's a reason. You know, being a bit of a generalist, I'm not bringing some of the expertise that some of the other guests do on that show. I am bringing the ability to talk, but they find people who can talk. And in this instance, all I was told was coming on to talk about the grand bargain and the role that so-called entitlements, social insurance programs are playing in the context of the grand bargain. And when I got there, I found out that one of the guests, and I was doing like the middle segment, 8:30 or something after the filibuster reform segment, which was actually fascinating. And so the original guest who was supposed to be on with us as well, I can't remember who it was an expert on these programs, an economist. And so, but they had laryngitis, they couldn't show up, whatever it was. So I was on with Richard Arenberg, who was the author of Defending the Filibuster, who had been in the segment prior, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, who's an MSNBC contributor, and I think she's a senior analyst at Latino Decisions and a fellow at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and this other guy, Donahue Peebles, who is the chairman and CEO of the Peebles Corporation and a member of President Obama's National Finance Committee. Now, the Finance Committee is basically, I can't remember what the Bush pioneers, or basically the guy in charge of helping raise money and then sticks around to advise on issues of money. I didn't really think much. I didn't know if there was going to be an argument about any of these. I had no idea. It didn't even occur to me. I was really very focused on making sure that I ate a piece of pastry on camera, because that apparently is there's a massive Up with Chris subculture that is focused on that. And I also I have a propensity when I see free pastry to eat it. I can't help it. So we started off with Chris going through the state of the negotiations, and this is and at one point I explained that what was really interesting in terms of what was happening is that the Republicans, their bluff has basically been called. The Democrats said, if you want to cut so-called entitlements, just tell us what it is. And the Republicans came back with, well, no, you have to tell us what you propose to cut out of Medicare and Social Security. And this is the game that the Republicans have played in the past. They get the Democrats to make a cut, and then the Republicans have run against them on that cut. And then they went to Peebles talking about President Obama's new grand bargain position. Francesca Soto talks about getting into more cuts and how people supposedly have been pulling off from Norquist. And then this is what happens. Peebles sort of pivots, and it occurred to me at one point, probably during the break after the segment, that's why he's here. Not just to pontificate on it, but he literally, this is his agenda. This is clip number 1.
Cut programs, obviously, and the Republicans don't.
Okay, we'll start that over again. So here is Donahue Peebles talking about what's next in the grand bargain.
I don't think anybody wants to cut programs, obviously, and the Republicans don't, because they're now in what they consider the rebuilding mode. But, the challenge is going to be that there are Democrats. So if you take a look at some of these tax issues, for example, estate taxes, the president is not going to have unified support from the House on that issue because he's going to lose, most likely, the Congressional Black Caucus. He's going to lose representatives of farming states because it's going to decimate
It is not going to decimate.
Well, actually,
that is an absolute ridiculous.
Okay, now wait a second. Let me explain what just happened here. So Peebles, after talking about all this stuff that completely, mostly non-controversial in any way, then just sort of raises the fact that where he thinks there's going to be a problem for the president is in the estate tax. He's going to lose the Congressional Black Caucus, and we'll get to that in a minute, and he's going to lose senators from farm states because the estate tax could devastate farmers. Now, Hayes immediately says that's a bunch of crap, and it's because that anybody who spent any time looking at this knows that there were 100 families across the country who own farms who are subject to the estate tax. It's not even remote. There will be 300 families across the country who own farms, who would be subject to the estate tax. Under President George W. Bush, the estate tax dropped to 35% after a $5 million exemption for an individual to pass on to his kids. So an individual can pass on $5 million worth of assets, and then whatever they pass on beyond that gets taxed at a 35% rate after that. President Obama wants to raise this rate to 45% after a $3.5 million exemption. Before George Bush, it was 55% after a $1 million exemption. So President Obama is taking us back to a rate that still is below the pre-George Bush tax rates. And there are some Democrats, guys like Max Baucus in the Senate, a couple other Democrats in the Senate, McCaskill, maybe Tester, maybe Pryor of Arkansas. Now, Arkansas, we know why. That's where the Walton family is. I mean, we're literally talking about a tax that applies to a certain amount of, a handful of families in this country. And this guy's bringing up the Congressional Black Caucus. Of the 3,600 estates subject to the estate tax this year in the country, 3,600. 100 are classified as farming estates. The number of estates subject to the tax would double under the plan proposed by Obama. So we're talking about an infinitesimally small group of people here. And this guy is out there defending it for some reason.
Let's think about it this way. Let's look at it from African Americans' perspective. Hundreds of years of oppression. Finally, there's an opportunity to go and compete in a balanced way in this economy today. But there's a head start. And so of generational transferring of wealth. And so finally now, with equality that's taken place since the Civil Rights Movement, you have a more alignment of wealth.
Do you see what's happening here? The guy is using the Civil Rights Movement as some type of fig leaf for why millionaires should retain as much wealth as possible. And I immediately go into like a complete, I'm almost jumping out of my chair at this point. Now, I should say, I didn't know who this guy was, this guy Peebles. But it turns out that, I've since done a little bit of research. It turns out that Donahue Peebles was named, and God bless him, congratulations, one of the top 10 wealthiest African Americans in the country by Forbes magazine. I have it here somewhere, but it turns out this guy has a net worth of millions upon millions of dollars. Millions upon millions of dollars here. Here it is. $350 million as of May 2009, according to Forbes. So when this guy's talking about we need to allow African American success stories, to pass on their wealth dollar for dollar to their kids to catch up to the white people who've been doing it for a long time. But we are still, even when we talk about white people, talking about an infinitesimally small number of people. And in terms of black millionaires, we're also talking about an infinitesimally small number of people. However, one of them apparently was sitting to my left, in between me and the Danish on Up with Chris, and he was worth at least $350 million.
And now it's going to be wiped out by 55%.
Such an infinitesimally small number of people. I mean, literally, we could fit all of the people you're talking about probably in this room.
Well, you're
talking about African Americans in the United States who are subject to the estate tax?
I'm not arguing the actual merits of the issue. I'm telling you the politics of it. The Congressional Black Caucus voted with George Bush the last time around on the state taxes,
we're going to talk
and they
about
are
the politics of it.
By the way, and they are again.
Okay, so now you see what he's done. He has now pivoted from making the argument that we should repeal the estate tax to now just being a commentator who's saying, these are the politics. I'm not arguing the merits of the policy now. He's made this shift. He's immediately just ducked my accusation, essentially, not an accusation, assertion about the estate tax. And now he's just talking about the politics. Now, it is true, the Congressional Black Caucus, there were 8 defectors back during George Bush's administration that voted with him on the estate tax. I think half of whom are gone. One was Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas, sort of a surprise, but we're talking about the money they get from millionaires. Al Wynn, I think, from Maryland, who's gone. Jefferson from Louisiana, gone because he had money in his refrigerator or freezer or whatever it was. Bishop from Georgia, Scott from Georgia, obviously the same millionaire donor down there. I mean, so we're talking about, he's making this as if this is a big civil rights issue. You had 8 defectors from the Congressional Black Caucus who just got bought out.
Well, I don't think anybody wants to cut.
All right, so I go on and basically make that argument with Don Peebles, and then during the break, I basically tell him that what he's talking about is a complete fig leaf. I don't realize at this point that I'm standing next to the number 10 in 2009 wealthiest black Americans in the country. I don't know that he's got $350 million worth of assets. I don't realize that I have not just said that the only reason why the politics are happening here are because of money, but I don't realize that I'm actually saying, like, no, the only reason why there's the Congressional Black Caucus or anybody else doing this is probably because of your money or your buddy's money. And he's using this as if this is a civil rights issue. It's just absurd. And he keeps talking about political reality now into the break. So I am steaming mad because this guy he sees me as some type of, hippie. And during the break, he's going like, well, what about your dad? I mean, how did you, and I said, well, my dad's an attorney. His dad was an attorney. They haven't been subject to the estate tax rule. But even if they were, great. The argument is that he is trying to make during the break that I'm doing this from white privilege. Now, this is a guy whose father was a mechanic, Peebles, worked his way up, got into real estate. God bless. I'm excited he has $350 million. I hope he has $500 million by now. Maybe he has $700 million. It doesn't matter to me. And I'm happy that his kids are going to get $5 million, and then after that, let's say he has $500 million to give to them. They get $5 million, and then they get taxed at a 35% rate on the $495 million. And so they'll end up with another $250 million to split between the two of them. I don't feel bad for them. So then we come back in after the break. I'm telling him that this is a fig leaf. Hayes comes back. He turns to the talk of cutting Medicare. And here it is.
The big problem is the rate of growth of healthcare costs. I think we could all agree on that, right?
Yep.
Now, Medicare the rate of growth in Medicare is significantly lower than the rate of growth of healthcare costs in the private sector. So it's doing a better job of controlling costs relative to the private sector. Then we just passed a huge bill that was incredibly contentious, which is called the Affordable Care Act, the vast majority of the legislative language of which is about controlling costs in healthcare over the future. And so it seems to me like the reasonable thing to do is to wait 4 years, 5 years, implement the bill, and see if the cost control measures that have been put in place, fought about tooth and nail, not like, smuggled in the cover of night, like hugely, hugely controversial, whether those cost containment methods work. And then, we can all sit at this table 5 years from now. And I don't understand why this isn't just the opening position of Democrats. And as someone who's on the Hill, shouldn't that be the opening position?
Well, yes.
Thank you. Well said.
So I included that clip where Arenberg at the end agrees, and this guy is sitting next to me, and he's basically agreeing with most of what I say. I mean, I have no idea who he is. And Hayes has laid it out now, because apparently, they obviously knew who Peebles was and what he had been advocating. And I should say at this point that in my study of who this guy Peebles is, not only did I find that he was worth at least $300-400 million, apparently he was one of these guys who over the summer told HuffPo that he was mad with President Obama for attacking hedge funders and private equity guys. I look and see at those things that are becoming offensive to some of his strongest supporters financially. It would be unrealistic to think that that kind of thing would not impact the enthusiasm for those who are supportive of the president financially, and certainly would turn off others who are on the fence to say, you know what the heck with it, I'm done. And they go on to Romney. So this is Donahue Peebles, who has raised at least between $100,000 and $200,000 for President Obama, saying, it's not me, but there are other people out there. This is the way this guy works it, right? It's always other people who are advocating for certain things. Not him, of course. He says there are other people out there. Now, my support for President Obama is very strong, but there are other people out there who are pretty pissed. He goes on to say, I'm so tired of hearing that the rich are not paying their fair share of taxes. Yeah, we are. The super vast majority of wealthy Americans do not wake up every day and say, let's see how we can pay less than our fair share of taxes. Of course they don't. They look up and say, what a beautiful view I have. Or, man, do I feel great. That's a wonderful $15,000 mattress I slept on. They say we're going to follow the law and we're going to hire some good accountants to tell us how to do it, and we're going to pay no more, no less than our fair share. What? This is the way this guy's defending paying these lowest tax rates on $350 million since the 1940s? Is, hey, I wake up every morning and I just think I'm going to hire the best accountant I can, so I'm paying not a dime more than I'm legally responsible for. So what should be said is that the wealthy Americans should have their tax rates raised because we need more money. Now, by the way, if they got all these tax raises, it still wouldn't put a dent in the national debt. So that's who this Peebles guy is. And here's where I start to stick a finger in his eye because I'm pissed. I'm realizing what this guy is about, and it's really pissing me off, and now I'm trying to agitate him a little bit.
Has been some of the precedent in the past.
Getting back to your original question, I think, frankly, it has to do with the same thing as why we're debating maintaining historically low estate taxes. It's money. Right. There is absolutely no reason in terms of the budget to be even talking about Social Security. And in terms of Medicare, it's the exact same thing. I'm sure there are cuts that can be made in terms of efficiencies, particularly when it comes to pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of savings there. I mean, you have...
All right. Then Hayes asked me to describe those, and I talk about where we could have the government be able to get a volume discount for the drugs that it's paying, and we could also get rid of patent some type of patent reform, we would save $300 billion at least over the course of 10 years. So I've stuck my finger in his eye, and then we come back for the third segment, and this is where I make an argument about means testing. And people and I start going after it.
Really interesting. I want to show some polling because I think one of the weirdest dynamics is this
And this is Hayes talking about the state of play in the argument that we're seeing in Washington. And I had this conversation with Francesca Di Sotto during the break where I was like, there's nothing less popular than cutting Medicare or Social Security. It's only rich people in Washington who want to do it. And she just looked at me like, what? It's unbelievable. And so here's Hayes basically drawing out that point.
Match between where public opinion is on something, on what we call on the show social insurance, and where the kind of beltway conversation is about the, quote, entitlements that need to be fixed. And so when you say to people, you will read in the wonk world, and you'll read in Politico, well, people are floating the idea of raising the retirement age on Medicare. This is one of those things. The Republicans are saying, no, it's not enough to sort of whittle around the edges. We need changes in eligibility. That's that's the red line they've thrown out. Now go ask the American people who have just been through an election, how do you feel about raising the retirement age on Medicare? And this is what they tell you.
Now, I should say that eligibility comment, this is, I think, Hayes also baiting Peebles because he says Republicans are arguing for changes in eligibility, that raising the age, in other words.
71% of Democrats oppose, 68% of Republicans oppose, and 62% of independents oppose. It's very hard to find a less popular, proposal than this, and yet this is at the not even in the margins, at the center of the conversation when people start talking about a grand bargain. And Sam, you were elucidating a kind of argument for why that was right when we went to break.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the establishment in this country, whether it's the political or frankly, the media establishment in this country.
The worst.
They simply do not. They don't have the sensitivity towards this. I mean, when you talk about raising the eligibility for Medicare age, you're talking about privatizing it. The costs aren't going to go away. It's just simply you're going to say instead of
for
support,
those 2 years, right?
Instead of support for our seniors, we're going to force these seniors, who in many cases may not be able to afford it, or their kids to pay for it. So this idea that somehow this is, we're burdening our grandkids by not cutting Medicare, well, that's ridiculous.
Right. Now, I should say what I'm doing there is very consciously taking what I anticipate Peebles' talking point is going to be. Based upon our conversations at the break and how annoyed he was with me, I just had the sense that all of a sudden I realized this guy is a no labels guy. This is a guy who is basically just a Pete Peterson guy, and this is always the talking point, right? We're burdening our grandkids by actually having the government in some way provide the most efficient health insurance for the grandparents.
Because those grandkids are going to pay for it, and they're actually going to pay more in the private insurance industry than they would through Medicare. And that's just a fact. And so, and I'm talking about those grandkids literally. They don't have, they're going to be paying for their grandparents or their parents to get health insurance on those ages if you raise it. So the savings is not going to, it's simply we're going to push it on to individuals, we're going to push it on to the other generations, and we're going to make it cost more because we know that Medicare controls costs more and is delivered more efficiently.
I agree with him, actually, that because the next step of that, of course, is that the kids and the grandkids will be burdened with it, and that's a greater drain in the economy because it takes their money and spending power out of the economy and puts it into healthcare. However, though, I do think there should be some further adjustments on eligibility. For example, someone like me, I do not believe that I should be able to get the same kind of benefits as, say, a retired school teacher. And so, therefore, I should have to pay a greater copay. The threshold before I got any benefits should be there. Now, also, my children, hopefully, if they are successful, I think we have a responsibility to take care of our parents, too, if we can. The government needs to be helping people who can't help themselves, that are going to have difficulty doing that.
And I'm glad you made this argument, because this is the argument that you hear Pete Peterson make, who's a big, sort of funding a lot of the groups that are talking about attacking the debt or the deficit. And you hear Mitch McConnell, you hear Republicans make it, and you hear some Democrats make it, which is basically, well, look, progressives, you guys care about redistribution and you care about all these things, equality, and we, that's good. Why have these universal benefits? When we don't have enough money, why have universal benefits for people that have a lot of money? I mean, that's the argument, right?
Indexing it.
Right, yeah. Indexing it, right? But making it an adjusted kind of thing. Means testing.
Okay, so there you have what Hayes has done is basically brought out what the essence of Peebles' argument is. Peebles is shrouding this. First he says, well, someone as rich as me shouldn't basically should have to pay more for my health insurance. And in fact, someone as rich as my kids should also pay for my health insurance if I can't afford it. So basically what he's saying is that this idea of universal access to health insurance for all seniors and ostensibly all people is problematic to this guy. He wants to see health insurance provided only as welfare. He wants to see it only as Medicaid, even though we also know that some 80% of people, regardless of what their income was when they were younger, end up in nursing homes or do so on Medicaid. He wants to make sure that there is no affirmative right to health insurance in this country. That's what his agenda is. And then Hayes basically calls him out and says, yeah, you and Pete Peterson. And so I come back with this, basically saying that there's a very efficient way of providing for means testing. And it's this.
Well,
why not?
First off, Medicare is already means testing.
Yes,
you already do have some measure of that. And if you want to means test it more, there's a very efficient way of doing that. A far more efficient way than to have a new bureaucracy that's going to determine what your net worth is, and that's called taxation.
Right.
And so we take it from you on the front end.
Right.
And then, frankly, that's what we should be doing with Social Security. We should be obliterating the cap. We can be raising taxes.
When you say obliterating cap, explain what that means.
Well, the cap right now, the first $110,000 of Social Security wages are taxed at about 6% for the employee, at 6% for the employer, a little bit more, 6.5%. And traditionally, we have taken in, through the Social Security system, 90% of the nation's income. We're now at about 81% because of income inequality. Right. If we take off that cap, we have complete solvency in Social Security, not just 20 years out, but until my kid has a kid who is looking towards Social Security. And we can do the same thing with Medicare.
Your kid is 40 years old, though. We should
My
say.
kid is actually significantly older.
Just so that everyone knows what you're saying.
I have a 7-year-old, and to the eye can see. And we can do the same thing with Medicare. If you're really concerned about means testing, there's an easy way.
That's interesting. So your point is, don't do it on the benefit side of means test. Just make sure that we're taxing.
Have people put more money into the system.
What do you think of that, Rich?
Right, I agree with, I mean, I think that the cap is, it creates this regressive pattern, and I mean, I think it's a long-term. It's the long-term solution on Social Security, but I don't think Social Security needs to be on the table.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like I think we all agree.
Now, that was Arenberg, Richard Arenberg, basically saying that he agrees with that about the Social Security. And the dynamic on Medicare is exactly the same. But now Peebles has to push back against this notion of, wait a second, my argument to means test. Now, the means testing, he doesn't care about the means testing. Because we all know that means testing, first off, saves you virtually no money. If every millionaire had to pay, and we already have some means testing in the context of Medicare and some parts of the insurance, but I mean, if you were to provide the means testing he's talking about, we're talking about such a small number of people, unless it became an incredibly a complicated system. But even still, you're talking about virtually no savings. Virtually no savings. So this is not really about means testing. This is about making Medicare into a welfare program, because it is far easier to cut a program that is not providing universal access, that is not for everybody. And that's his real agenda.
I think Medicare is being discussed.
Same dynamic.
But again, I don't think that we can ask the American people, especially job generators at the top end, to pay.
Wait, what? Job generators at the top end? We can't ask them what?
More in taxes other than what's being discussed.
Well,
now.
you're saying you want job generators to pay more for their health insurance.
Absolutely. At the time of consumption.
Let's do the most.
Give it to you in the front end and trust you to spend it well now. Yeah. Or trust the government to spend it well now.
Well, yeah, I trust the government to.
Now, he wants to do it at the time of consumption. So we have to create this whole bureaucracy that is not going to be efficient to determine whether or not this guy deserves insurance year to year, right? Because he could lose his money. He could lose all his money. That's his argument. It's going to be his argument shortly. They could lose all their money. So we're going to have to do this year to year to qualify, as opposed to making it nice and simple. Raise a little bit on his wage taxes. Raise a little bit on his income taxes. But we can't have that for job generators, because we all know that even despite the fact that Mitt Romney won't hire a guy to make his peanut butter and honey sandwiches, that if you take away any taxes from these job generators, they're not going to hire people. We've asked so much of them.
Spend things as well as anybody else, frankly. And
well,
so,
that's a frightening thought. Okay.
He doesn't like government spending.
Wait a second, though. When we're talking about this, I mean, we could talk about, we should just be very clear, right, about how this actually all works, right? There are, Social Security and Medicare have dedicated tax revenue streams, right? So when you're talking about the front end,
Medicare comes from the general fund.
Some of it comes from the general fund, but there's income taxes, then there's a bunch of other taxes in the tax code, and then there's these payroll taxes that you pay that create this distinct funding mechanism for these.
Now, so here Peebles doesn't like the idea of actually having to pay up front because, of course, like I say, it's much easier to cut the program if it's seen as a welfare program for poor people, and rich people can opt out. Taxes are forever. And then finally, this is where it ends.
Get more to the political aspect of it.
Now, remember, this guy loves to switch between what is political reality and what is the best policy. When you start to argue policy with him, he says there's no political reality. He's trying to keep all of this at arm's length. That's what his plan is. And DeFrancesco Soto, she's also looking at this in the same sort of fashion. It's interesting.
Maybe popularly people don't want to see Medicare touched. But the Beltway folks, the folks who are going to be voting on this, do want to see that. So what are we going to bring to the table? Are we just going to say...
Now, I'm going to start this over again because, I mean, think about what she's saying here. She's saying, okay, we've seen that Democrats and Republicans in the high 60s, Democrats in the low 70s, don't want any cuts to Medicare. But the people in Washington do. So what are we going to bring to the table? Who is we in her calculation? Is she now with those people who don't want cuts to Medicare? I mean, why do we have to bring anything to the table if there is no policy justification and no desire by the American public to cut Medicare? Who is we, and why do we have to do anything? Let's play it again from the beginning.
Get more to the political aspect of it. So maybe popularly people don't want to see Medicare touched. But the Beltway folks, the folks who are going to be voting on this, do want to see that. So what are we going to bring to the table? Are we just going to say, we're not going to bargain with you? I mean, at what level do we allow for, say, means testing? We may not like it, but that's what's going to allow.
Listen, means testing, we can do means testing. If you want to do means testing, there's a very efficient way of doing it. We will raise your taxes on
if you have more money.
But the reality is that's not going to happen.
Wait a second. We can talk about what we projected.
Look, we can talk about cutting defense spending 20% and cut defense spending 20% and put that into the general fund as well.
Okay, so what Peebles is doing here now is saying, but that's not going to happen. Your idea about taxing people more for Medicare is not going to happen. So now he's stepping back. He's no longer advocating a position. He's now just an observer again, right? That's not going to happen. And now also to add a little bit of spice in there, he says, we could also cut the Defense Department by 20 or 30% and put it in the general fund. That's not going to happen either. In other words, he's looking at me and saying, I am now going to put your idea of raising taxes to pay for Medicare if there's any type of shortfall into the realm of unicorns and fantasy land. That's what he's doing here with that.
Well, and we would be able to reduce hold everybody's taxes, but that's an action that's never going to take place.
But can I follow
what she's talking about? What she said is actually very valid. What's the fact is that there's going to have to be some give and take. However, the president.
Okay, so then he says, well, what she's saying is actually valid. So what you're saying, Sam, is crazy talk. What she's saying is valid. There has to be some give and take here. Now, where is he in this debate? He's pretending like he's just an observer, but in fact, he's one of the key players pushing an outcome. But this is what the no labels people do. This is what the Pete Petersons do. This is what the Joe Scarboroughs do. This is what the establishment does. They step back from the debate and say there has to be, they set up a context where they know a negotiation is going to lead them to their end. And then they step back and say, we have to all get along. Regardless of how crazy we think the dynamic is here, that's just the dynamic. That's immutable. That can't change.
Has played a very powerful hand by saying, okay, tell us what you want.
But let me say this on the give and take.
There's a reason why we can sit here and say it's never going to happen. And it will never happen until people acknowledge the reality of the situation from a policy standpoint. You can say that the Republicans are never going to allow for a more efficient way of means testing, which is to raise taxes on those. That's not debatable.
You're not even going to get Democrats
You're
to buy
talking
into
politically.
Okay.
But I mean, if you will.
Well, is that reality?
Okay.
We can.
In reality,
fantasy morning is theory.
In reality, if you join me in acknowledging the reality that the most efficient way of means testing Medicare would be to raise Medicare taxes now, that's a reality. Whether or not that's going to happen is another issue. But if you join me, we can join together.
Hold on a second. Think about it this way. We just had, we came off in the 2000s, the early to mid 2000s, the biggest boom in the nation's history. Then we went to the second biggest recession in the nation's history. So wealth has been redistributed and lost. Right. Now imagine that concept that you just talked about, where these.
Now, first off, he's lying. Wealth was lost, but I don't know if he's saying that it's just been lost by the wealthy. It's been lost by everybody. And the notion that it's been redistributed is also questionable. He's talking about things like food stamps have gone up. He's talking about things like that somehow we have unemployment insurance. But the fact of the matter is that income inequality has grown during this period. This guy has not suffered. But that's his argument. We have suffered. And here he's going to go to job generators again. Now, you saw what I was trying to do there. I was basically saying, okay, you want to have your reality is the politics? Well, then join me in admitting that the policy prescription is wrong. You wouldn't do that.
People are paid into it, and now they're in a different income position. That doesn't make sense. We should be taxed. Any kind of means test should be done at the time of consumption. For example, if I can afford to pay my health care, I should pay for it.
I mean, if we really.
So there, his argument is there are people who lost money, rich people. Okay, this is what he was just arguing, and it's absurd. He's saying that there were really rich people, maybe millionaires, maybe people who made over $500,000 a year, $700,000 a year, $1 million a year, whatever, who paid into the system under my regime that I'm proposing, would have paid into the system, whatever it is, an extra 10 grand a year, 25 grand a year. If they have the millions that he does, maybe $500,000 a year, maybe 200,000 a year. If he's making whatever, $20 million a year, I don't know, probably less. And then they lost all their money, and now they're on Medicare, and that's not fair. No, that's exactly why you have social insurance. That's exactly why you have social insurance. But that's his argument. Seems a little lame.
About the deficit and debt issues that we're talking about.
Yes, but the key thing here is, which is my mantra, is that no one actually cares about the deficit and debt.
Well,
that's the key thing. People talk about it because it's the word they give to the stuff they really care about. Right. Richard Ehrenberg from the Strength and Social Security Campaign, Sam Seder of the Majority Report, Don Peebles of the President's National Finance Committee, and MSNBC contributor Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. Thanks for being here. That was great.
And that's the end of it there. And so that was my I was rather excited. I felt bad because at one point I cut off Hayes, and I couldn't contain myself. I think he understood. I mean, I think to a certain extent that's why he wanted me on there. There were times where off camera he was like, I think, egging me on. But that, if you want to know, if you want to see, and I'm convinced this Peebles guy was just sort of shocked. Yeah, and believe me, he didn't seem too happy with me afterwards. I went up and I, shook his hand because for me that was a tremendous amount of fun. I don't get the opportunity to basically tell a plutocrat, you're lying to the country or you're lying to yourself. But that is the mentality of these people. So when you see the Pete Petersons, and we should say, yes, this guy, a big donor to, or a big bundler, I should say, for President Obama. In the 2010 cycle, 2008 cycle, I think he was also a bundler for Obama. I'm not sure, but he gave to Raul Martinez, a Democrat in Florida, Rudolph Moisey, another Democrat in Florida, the 17th and 21st. I don't know them. I do know who the Republican Party of Florida is. And back in 2000, he gave $5,000 to the Republican Party of Florida. So, I mean, this gives you this is a species of Democrat that exists out there. This is a plutocrat. There is no other better way to describe them. And we had real insight into the way that they argue and how you get from being a plutocrat to the no labels or third way movement. That is to pretend the influence of your money has not changed the political dynamic and then step back and say, this is the political dynamic. Let's just be reasonable here and try and get along. Some people, for whatever reason, we don't need to discuss the merits, don't want an estate tax. Some other people, I'm going to pretend that I'm one of those people until I'm cornered, do think there should be an estate tax. And we can't have it because, of course, there were 8 members of the Congressional Black Caucus back in 2003 that supported getting rid of the estate tax. So this is a civil rights issue. And I'm sure if this guy was a white guy, he would have some other argument. We're keeping out new money from growing, whatever it is. So it was a stunning insight. Wanted to share it with you.